Ladies and gentlemen, our special guest on this episode of the Paul Leslie Hour is Michael Shnayerson. The new book is Harry Belafonte, My Song, a memoir with Michael Shnayerson. It's a great pleasure.
Thanks, Paul. Nice to be with you.
My first question, who is Michael Shnayerson?
And why did he write this book? Well, I'm a longtime contributing editor to Vanity Fair, and I have written for other books on sort of rather disparate subjects. But the most recent of those had some connection to getting me to the Harry book, which that book was called Coal River. It came out in 2008, and it was about these West Virginians struggling against this terrible scourge of what they call mountaintop coal mining. And Harry read that book and liked it, and that was one reason that he asked if I would work with him.
Is Mr. Belafonte a big reader?
You know, I think he has been at times in his life. I mean, he's the first to say that he dropped out of ninth grade in the 40s, and for some time after that, he felt he really wasn't a reader. But then, when he came back from serving in the Navy in the war, he became swept up by the theater, and he became a great student of drama, of plays. I think ever since he has been a reader. He is certainly a very articulate guy, which made my job a lot easier.
I kind of want to go back a little. What was life like for you growing up?
Well, I grew up in Manhattan on the Upper West Side. My father was a journalist, actually, for Time magazine, and I had, I guess, a sort of barely upper middle class upbringing in that I went to collegiate school, which was a private school on 77th Street, and actually, looking back on it, it's sort of ironic, I guess, or at least striking, that Harry was only a few blocks away, living his life on 75th and West End. And I should perhaps add, I'm 56 and Harry is 84, so we were worlds apart in various ways, but geographically we were actually rather close.
So tell us, when did you become acquainted, or when were you exposed to Harry Belafonte? Well,
I mean, certainly as I grew up, my family had his records, I knew his music. I feel that I was probably, as someone who is 56, kind of at the tail end of those who were being exposed to his music when it first appeared. I mean, remember his million-selling album Calypso came out in, I think it was 1956, and he was the hottest singer in the world probably that year, even hotter than Elvis, believe it or not. So I was then very young, but you know, when I got to be 8 or 10 years old in the 60s, people were still playing Harry's records, and that was my exposure to him. But that was it.
And how did you meet Harry Belafonte personally?
Well, this is one of those serendipities of publishing. I live now on the east end of Long Island in a town called Bridgehampton. One of my good friends who lives in Sag Harbor on the weekends is an editor at Random House. Peter Gathers is his name. He was the one who signed up Harry initially to do what was going to be a memoir that Harry would write. That was back in about 2008, I think. You know, Harry struggled with that. He knew all the stories he wanted to tell. He'd never written a book before, and he just struggled to get them on the page, and finally he said that he really needed a writer to help him. Peter put my hat in the ring along with about 3 other writers, and fortunately Harry chose me. So that was about 2009.
The book is called Harry Belafonte, My Song, a memoir with Michael Shnayerson, and Michael Shnayerson is our special guest. When you first met Harry Belafonte, what was your first impression of him?
Well, that's a good question. He walked into Peter Gether's office at Random House, and he just radiated this energy of, I don't know, goodness and good humor. It's sort of remarkable. Peter had told me, actually, that when he first met Harry, he and the head of Knopf, Sonny Mehta, had Harry into their office, and Harry just started telling these stories. And by the time they'd heard 20 minutes of stories, they said, "That's it, we're signing you up. Here's the contract. We're excited." And I felt the same way when I met him. he's an enormous, sort of force of nature, I suppose is one way to put it, but he's a happy man. He's a passionate man. He's certainly, as probably most of your listeners know, passionate about social causes. Those are never far from his mind. And he's also funny. He's really one of the funniest people I've ever met. And so it was absolutely a delight. And I could only hope that he would feel that I was right for him, and thankfully he did.
I'm really grateful that this book came along, because it's like he's finally getting his due. He's finally getting a book, because I think I might have shared this with you earlier. As you know, I'm a huge Belafonte buff.
Yeah.
I went to the library one day, and I asked the librarian, can you help me find a book about Harry Belafonte? Thinking that there has to be a few of them. And a couple people didn't believe me when I said that the only 2 books were written for young adults, and they were written a long time ago. Why do you think there has been no book about this man?
Well, I certainly wondered that myself. As public a figure as he was in the 50s and 60s, he was a very private man about his life. He didn't feel the need to write an autobiography, and he was still then quite young. I mean, he was in his 20s and his 30s, so that was really the farthest thing from his mind. There was one biography of him written back in about 1960, but it was sort of a cut-and-paste job, as we say, because Harry chose not to cooperate with that person. He just didn't see the need for any book about him. And then, why no book since then? Well, Harry did have this meteoric rise, celebrity and fame in the 50s that lasted well through the 60s, and in a way radiated ever since. However, I think it would be fair to say that by the late 60s, early 70s, he was not reaching newer or younger generations. He was reaching the one that had gone with him in the first place. And it just, I think from probably since he didn't want to cooperate and he was no longer quite at the apex of his celebrity, it just didn't make sense for someone else to write a biography about him. So to me, it was an enormous, as a writer, as a journalist, it was a great bit of good fortune that nothing had been done. I mean, this was fresh territory indeed.
What was your initial thought when you were approached? Do you want to be a part of this book?
To be honest, my initial thought was, well, this is a very interesting possibility. I know Harry Belafonte as the singer he is and was, but I hadn't done that kind of book before. I'd written 4 books of my own. I was not, someone champing at the bit to do a collaborative work. It was actually not until I began to read more about Harry's civil rights work that I got really excited, because I realized this wasn't just an entertainer's story. This was really an American story. This was a story about essential chunks of history in the mid-20th century, the most important one being the whole civil rights movement, because he was centrally involved. And that got me very excited.
As you just mentioned, there are so many different facets to Belafonte. You just mentioned his involvement with the civil rights movement. What was the process of researching for this book like?
Well, the first time I actually went over to meet with Harry, he still lives on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I said, all right, Harry, let's start by looking at all your archives and all your troves of letters and all that stuff. And he looked at me and said, I don't have any of that stuff. I said, what? He said, no, I never imagined I would write a book, and I never kept any of that stuff. No letters, no papers, no clippings. Well, he did have a sort of clip service from yellowed clips from the 1950s, and later I did see some of those. But, honestly, it was really, he said it was in his head, and I'm not sure I entirely believed him, but as he began to tell these stories of his childhood, they were riveting, and I realized, my God, he is one of these very rare people who really does have not only a fascinating life, but a fascinating life that he can still tell in vivid stories. So, he would tell these stories, and then I would go out and do the obvious kind of research to kind of fill in the chink. if he would mention a movie that, like Island and Sun, that he was in 1957, I would go back and easily confirm exactly when the filming was, and maybe what was going on at the time. It was interesting in that particular instance that was an interracial romance movie, quite a good movie, by the way, should your listeners want to rent it now, Island in the Sun. At the same time that Harry was undergoing a divorce from his first wife, who was black, and secretly marrying his second wife, who was white. And so there was a fascinating confluence between what was going on publicly and privately in his life, and sometimes doing research would help, highlight those connections.
Our special guest is Michael Shnayerson. The book is entitled Harry Belafonte, My Song, a Memoir with Michael Shnayerson. Did you listen to a lot of the music? Harry Belafonte has such a vast discography of all types of music. As part of research for this book, did you go back and listen to all those albums?
Oh, I listened to quite a few of them, for sure, enough to really learn in a way that I hadn't taken in when I was a kid hearing them, but really learn how wide his range was, how brilliant he was to, for example, not just mine calypso, but to record folk songs, essential folk songs from all cultures, so that he would be expressing those feelings of working men who wrote those songs, but he also wouldn't be pigeonholed, in calypso, which could really have happened to him in about 1956. So I certainly listened to enough music to appreciate all that. I didn't, I have to say, go right through his discography and listen to everything, because ultimately this was not a memoir about the records so much as it really was about the man, and that I was getting from him directly.
What is the most remarkable thing you learned as a result of writing My Song?
I didn't realize that Harry, in the early 1960s, when John Kennedy became president, Harry by then was working with Martin Luther King very closely. I knew that as I began to do some research, and as we began to get up toward that stage in his storytelling. I didn't know, however, that Harry was really kind of the central conduit between the Kennedys on the one hand, that is to say John and Bobby, his Attorney General, between the Kennedys on the one hand and Martin Luther King and the rest of the movement on the other. The fact is that the Kennedys were sort of blindsided by civil rights. John Kennedy got into office in 1961. He just thought civil rights was sort of an annoyance, and if you threw a few bones to these protesting blacks down south, they should just calm down. And, of course, it was an exploding social movement, and it wasn't going to just go away. And the Kennedys began to realize they really needed contacts with this movement, and they weren't very comfortable with Southern Baptist ministers who surrounded Martin Luther King. They were much more comfortable with an urbane celebrity like Harry, who could appreciate their point of view while also being Dr. King's emissary. And there was a lot of back-channel, important dialogue that went on between the Kennedys and King. Harry was the facilitator of that, and that was really fascinating to me.
For anyone that reads My Song, what do you want the reader to take away from the experience of reading?
I think anyone who reads this book will appreciate just the breadth and depth of Harry's career achievements and the degree to which his life is a kind of bright line through much of the 20th century. I think anyone will appreciate that, but what I would hope readers would also appreciate is just the degree of Harry's commitment to social causes, to really combating injustice wherever he saw it. And that's something that we need more of. We need that DNA to get past to the rest of us. And it's fascinating, I might just add, to see this whole Occupy Wall Street movement really mushrooming. Harry is fascinated by it. He's fascinated and impressed by the fact that it is being conducted very much as a nonviolent campaign, which it was, of course, Dr. King's whole M.O. and very much Harry's. So it's cheering to think maybe in some way that DNA is being passed on. But that's what I would hope a reader would come away with.
I have two final questions for our special guest, Michael Shnayerson. What is the best thing about being Michael Shnayerson?
Oh, boy. My first answer would be my 16-year-old daughter, Jenna, whom I adore. But I think I am fortunate to be able to have a life that's balanced between magazine writing for Vanity Fair and book writing. It's not something I necessarily set out to do, but it's a very nice balance. Whenever I'm between magazine stories, assuming I have a book going, I can always fall back on the book. And it's just a very nice rhythm of work, and one that has enabled me to learn about all sorts of different subjects, be paid for it. So I think that's what I feel I'm luckiest for.
My last question. In reading the book, My Song, one of the things that is so fascinating about Harry, the music that he's most famous for is Caribbean influence, yet he has fans all over the world, Germany. Right. My last question, for anybody who listens to our interview, wherever they are, what would you like to say to the people listening?
I think I would like to say that Harry Belafonte really is a kind of international ambassador. He very much set out to be that. He actually worked for the Peace Corps and then for UNICEF, and he was very serious about those commitments. And whenever he went to Europe and gave concerts, he not only gave his all as a singer, he also expressed political views, which were not always the prevalent views that the U.S. State Department would have liked him to express. In other words, he really connected with people all over the world. And I think that makes him a very rare and marvelous person, and I would just hope that your audience would get that impression when they read my song, too.
Well, Mr. Shnayerson, first of all, thank you for writing this book. Second of all, thank you for joining me as an interview guest.
Great, Paul. Thank you. Thanks for bringing your audience's attention to the book.